Hello everyone, this is Grandmaster Josh Friedel, and today I'm going to be talking about avoiding positional blunders. So I want to talk about it from point of views of different kinds of players because I think avoiding positional mistakes is something which you want to start off early. I think a lot of people try to, are like, all right, well, when I'm starting out chess, I have to learn tactics and I have to learn some openings, I have to learn checkmates, etc. And these are all more important things for a long time, right? But I think that learning basics of positional chess early is actually really good for development because it helps fill out your game better, it helps avoid a lot of mistakes. And even though most beginner games and even more advanced games are decided by tactics, often people get put in bad positions because of positional mistakes, and then it makes it easier to blunder tactics. Even if ultimately a tactic is what costs you the game, you often end up in a difficult position because of positional mistakes that are maybe not necessary. So I wanted to talk about them. We're gonna start off kind of more basic and go to a little bit more advanced. So like the we're gonna do 4 positions. This position is maybe the simplest, and then we get slightly more complicated, etc. So there are several ways to avoid positional mistakes. In this case, we're talking about a specific type of positional mistake, which is a pawn move or having to move a pawn in a way that weakens a square or squares. This is something that happens in chess all the time. If you play a chess game, you're going to move pawns, almost for sure. If you're not moving any pawns, you're definitely doing something wrong. And every time you move a pawn, you're giving up squares when you think about that, right? So, for example, when I played the pawn, I wasn't me, but whoever played this game played the pawn from c2 to c3, they're giving up slight control over d3 and b3. Does this matter? Not particularly, right? These squares are still well covered. It's not that meaningful. You don't want to be terrified of moving your pawns. But you want to be aware of the fact that every time you move pawns, you give up potential control over squares, and sometimes you block pieces. For example, the pawn on e6 blocks this bishop on c8. A lot of you have seen ideas like this. It's nothing new. And in this position, you look at what squares have been given up. The only move that really looks out there is this move h4. I get computers love to play h4, h5 very early, but I'm pretty sure even AlphaZero and Leela would really frown on playing this instead of controlling the center and developing your pieces. But here we want to come to the avoiding positional blunders. And as strange as h4 looks, I would not call it a positional blunder. And the very simple reason is that you're not giving up control over a square in like an irreparable way. Positional blunders, when we talk about blunders, we're talking about mistakes that cannot be repaired, that are like detrimental to your position in a more permanent way. Like it's not something you can take back, and it's something your opponent can take advantage of. So in this position, this was a beginner game. Of course, you have many decent moves here. The move d4 comes to mind. Just put a pawn in the center. Completely normal. The move knight f3, develop a piece towards the center. All fine, right? There's a reason why I think beginners and even more advanced players should use general opening principle stuff because for the most part, there's a good reason for it, right? You want to control the center, you want to put pawns in the center, all of this stuff makes sense. But in the game, white played the move f3. Now, I know this move is a bit ridiculous and you shouldn't be moving your f-pawn so much in the opening anyway, and they're not developing their pieces. There's all sorts of things wrong with it. But I want to focus particularly on why this is a positional blunder. Why do you think it might be? Why is this a positional blunder, very specifically? Because it's kind of like c3 and h4 in that it's a pawn move. It looks a little weird if you know how to play openings normally. These are not normal moves. Again, we're going to move to different examples. I just want to show this at its most pure form. But okay, we have the move f3. I'm sure a lot of you noticed it weakens, in particular, the g3 square. Now again, it weakens e3 as well, but e3 is guarded. g3 is the problem, this square. And you'll notice that the reason why it's a positional blunder is because number one, that's not a completely permanent weakness, but it's pretty annoying to control, right? Like how does white control that square with a piece? It's not so easy. And number two, the opponent can take advantage. These are the two requirements usually. Oftentimes you can weaken a square really badly, and if your opponent has no way to take advantage, it's actually not so bad. In this case, Black can play many moves, the simplest in my mind being bishop d6, threatening mate in 1. And the problem is defending that square is really hard. White's best moves are probably things like either something ridiculous looking like king f2, which obviously puts the king on an awful square, not what you want. You can play a move like d4 and allow bishop check, king d2, and now your king ends up on this horrible square. Black can take this pawn. I don't even know if it's necessary, right? The pawn's probably not even the most important feature of the position. Probably if I'm black, I'm going to try to develop pieces, try to open the center while this king is nice and exposed, right? One move, which of course is very entertaining, is rook h3. It looks like it defends the g3 square, but this is actually a horrid blunder. For those of you who have seen the pattern before, you can go on. But if you haven't seen this pattern, pause and try to figure out what black should play here. It's kind of pretty. So for those of you who have seen this before, it's not as thrilling, but it's always a cool thing when you haven't seen it before. Queen takes h4 check. Looks crazy, but the idea is after rook takes h4, you give checkmate. So, okay, this is kind of a silly example, but I wanted to show very specifically what a positional blunder looks like. In this case, in this video, I'm really focusing on the weakening of squares more than anything else. So the f3 move is a positional blunder because it weakens the g3 square. Pretty obvious, right? Like nothing, I am not sharing too much news with most of you. However, I wanted to kind of start with something simple and move to more complex. So our next example is this position. White sacrificed a pawn early on, played the move bishop c4. This was again from a beginner game. And there are plenty of reasonable moves for black. There's the move, that was the move played. There's the move knight f6, just developing a piece. There's the move e6. And this is one thing I want you to make note of. In the other position, white had several reasonable moves. In the other position, in this position, black has several reasonable moves. And this is the main thing I want to get across, that one way to avoid positional blunders, one of the most obvious ways is to ask yourself, well, is this necessary? Because there are lots of positional blunders that are made where the choice is difficult, and we will get to that, like where you have to decide, okay, is this worthwhile to weaken this square? Is this something I have to do, etc., etc. But if it's not necessary, then the easiest way to avoid it is simply not doing it. If you're not sure, well, is this weak square going to matter? Oh, but I have this move, which is totally fine. Go with the totally fine move. Most of the time, that's going to help you avoid a lot of errors, because it sounds very basic, but a lot of positional blunders I see from beginners, from novices, even from more advanced players, are based on moves or decisions they don't have to make. Like, a lot of the time, there are weakening pawn moves that don't really do that much. And maybe the weakness is horrible and maybe it's defensible, but who cares, right? Like, if you don't have to do it, you don't. The cases that are more difficult are ones where it serves a very specific purpose, or you're trying to do something in particular, or you have to defend against a threat. Then you have to make tougher choices. And again, we will get to those. But here in the game, black played bishop e6. And again, maybe these tripled pawns are no big deal, but we don't have to allow them, right? First of all, I really hate them because now the king is exposed. We've already kind of seen that. The pawns are very annoying to defend, but even more importantly, in my view, it's really annoying to develop now because you can't get this bishop out so easily. If g6, you always have to watch out for h4, h5, and then this idea becomes very strong in a lot of cases. And it's just really annoying to develop and get pieces out in a nice way for black. So once again, this is an example of one where it's just not necessary. Now here's a trickier question, and this is one where even the people who are a bit more experienced watching might find this interesting. What do you think the best way to take advantage of this is? Like, what would you play as white? So if you want, pause your video, try to figure out how you'd take advantage of this particular move. So I'm going to guess a lot of you were tempted by queen h5 check. And this is very concrete, like it makes a lot of sense, right? You're attacking the rook. Black plays here, you take the pawn, everything looks great. Black plays here. So you look at material, you've won your pawn back, we're now even material. But look at what's happened. You've moved your queen 3 times, right? And black's gotten to play, okay, g6 is not that helpful, but it does get the bishop out. And I've played knight f6 and I've played knight c6. I've played 2 developing moves and a move that prepares to develop. Now black is ahead in development and attacking this d4 pawn, by the way. which, okay, you can play a move like c3 to defend it, but I play queen d6. I have pretty good pieces. If you trade queens, I take with the e-pawn. My pawn structure is a lot better. If you don't trade queens, I'm ready to play e5 and open up the center. I'm the one who's developed. Probably that's not going to end too well for white, if you ask me. So it's kind of funny. Already, I actually kind of like black's position. So it's very easy to make mistakes like this. If you wanted queen b5 check, this might be a bit better. Although, to be honest, I'm not so sure how tempted I would be by something like this. The c2 pawn's annoying. Again, black's development is good. The knight on d4 is strong. This is kind of not really the way to do it. So the reason I wanted to show this is quite often the way to take care of positional blunders is there are times you have to capitalize right away. But here's one of the great questions to ask yourself, and this is to do with also whether black plays bishop e6, is can the damage be repaired easily? And in this case, the answer is no. Moves like e5 don't really repair the damage. They sack the pawn back. You still have a weak pawn, all of this. There's no real great way for black to repair it, which means white doesn't have to try to jump on a bunch of queen moves or some crazy initiative necessarily. It doesn't mean you don't look at it, but at the moment, white's not developed. So I really like the developing moves. I think the most natural for me was knight c3 with the idea that if knight c6, bishop e3. Knight e2 is also quite possible, which has the advantage of threatening to castle and also has this knight f4 move, which could become quite nasty as well. So I think both of these moves are perfectly good and promise white just a very nice advantage, which was needless. Like black did not have to play bishop e6. And again, that's really what I want to center on. In this one, you don't necessarily need to have amazing positional judgment. You just have to go, well, tripled pawns, that looks kind of ugly. Do I have to have tripled pawns? No. So you will be surprised, but a lot of your positional blunders in your games, I am guessing, are from moves that are simply put not at all necessary. So let's move to examples that are slightly more complex. So let's take this one. I'm actually going to look at it from black's point of view. So this one, you have a more pressing issue. At the moment, the white queen is attacking your g7 pawn, as we can see. So the question is, what would you like to play as black to defend against it? And you can kind of guess where this is going. You have the move g6, which potentially creates weak dark squares around the king side. Or you can try to do something else. Either castles would be obviously a very nice move. You can play king f8 or rook g8. Are the moves that don't look so nice, but the question is, are those better than g6? So the real question is g6 necessary here? Do you think it's your best option or not? So this is another good one to pause on. This one definitely requires a bit more calculating. So definitely take a few minutes if you're able to. But what would you do? Do you think g6 is necessary here or the best option? So assuming you've unpaused here, this one is actually quite interesting. I can tell you this was from a student game of mine who is a bit beyond beginner, and like I don't know, like 1200-ish, 1400-ish player, like very very rising very quickly. And this decision actually, I believe in the game g6 was played, and I didn't really think anything of it because, quite honestly, I think for most players g6 is the move, and you'll see what I mean by this in a bit. Because black, it actually isn't the best move, but it's not the best move for a very specific reason. So g6 here does defend the pawn. It doesn't commit the king or the rook, so castling is still a potential move. The big drawback to it, of course, is white can play bishop h6. This was played in the game. And my student was actually white, and they actually lost this game, and I'll show you kind of how it went down a little bit. But the whole idea is after bishop h6, it's very annoying to castle. It's quite clear that this is not exactly what black wants. But one thing I will say is that even though you have these weak squares, at the very least you have different ideas. For example, d6 was played, hitting the queen, getting some pieces out. Black has pretty good development, and really, if you solve the one problem, just the weak squares by themselves are not going to be the end of the world. But here's the real question. What are the better options? Let's take the easy ones. Moves like rook g8 and king f8 are just worse. Surrendering your castling rights is just far, far worse than playing g6. And this is what I mean. This is where positional stuff comes into play a bit more, which is just that like, you have to be able to judge whether the positional thing you're giving up is worse than another thing. Giving up the right to castle when clearly castling queenside is both not easy and also not safe. Like, this is not a safe part of the board with these doubled pawns and with all of this going on. So you also have to get your bishop and queen out of the way, which is not the easiest thing in the world. So I would say that, you know, that giving up castling rights is a big deal. I understand that after g6, bishop h6, you can't castle, but you can potentially castle, meaning the bishop has to stay here. You could play bishop f8 and try to trade it off. You're not giving up on it entirely. So moves like king f8, I mean, you could play queen f3, for instance, hitting both of these. This looks pretty annoying. You're just going to play knight c3. It looks awful. A move like rook g8, you can play queen f3 again. You could play queen e4, hitting the h7 pawn. Like, it's very important to realize that those mistakes are far worse than g6 could ever be. Now, there are cases where g6 is really a horrible mistake because there are pieces coming in. But this is another key thing. How does my opponent take advantage? There are times when you create a weak square, your opponent can't take advantage at all. Then there are times when your opponent can take huge advantage, like right away. Like, you create a weak square, your opponent sinks a knight in, and you feel horrible about life. This one I'd say is somewhere in between. It definitely matters. You don't want to play g6. It definitely is annoying to allow bishop h6, but it's also, okay, not the end of the world. Like, it's not like a piece is going to land on f6 and checkmate you. Like, you'll survive, probably. But you've noticed I omitted castling, and the reason why is because I wanted to save this for last because it's kind of a cool thing. It actually is a really good move, but not for an obvious reason. So the main drawback to castling against a move like queen g4, this is a very common tactic if you want to store it in the memory banks, is the move bishop h6. So I'm threatening mate. And the whole concept is that if you play g6, which is the obvious way to defend against it, you do something like this, you take on f8 with a piece, white castles. It's quite clear, at least in my mind, that maybe black has a bit of compensation for the exchange, but not all that much. They don't even have a pawn for it. White's very well developed. Sure, it's a middle game. It might take a while for the rook to come in, but this is not nearly enough for an exchange. So again, g6 would be better than this option. However, black has quite a spectacular idea here. And this is something I certainly didn't see going over the game. It's one of those things where I often check my work with the computer, and not necessarily because I think it's most instructional. Sometimes instructing in a more human way is better because there are moves you would play in a game which you should not, like with the computer that might, or rather there are computer moves which probably you won't and should not play in a game because you can't figure it out. So this is a good example of that. The computer, but the nice thing is it finds some beautiful ideas, and this is an example of one. So bishop f6. I don't want to say I could never find this in a game because it is pretty logical, but it's also really unobvious and a very peculiar pattern. The idea being it looks like you're hanging a bishop. White really has to take it, otherwise you're going to play like d6 hitting the queen, take this pawn. It's going to be not so good for white. So you take here, and then the whole point is you're hitting the bishop, defending mate on g7, and you're hitting the b2 pawn. So the only way white can really defend against all of this is to bring the bishop back to c1, which is a horrible, undeveloping move, and then you play rook e8 check, and black has huge compensation for the piece. At first, it doesn't look like it could be enough, but the problem is a move like bishop e2 runs into bishop a6. This causes all sorts of problems. So probably the best move is king f1, but now we play knight b4. We're going to play d5 next, so the queen probably has to retreat to d1. d5, c5, our attack keeps going, and we have such huge development and compensation that this compensates for a piece. Like, we're down a piece for a pawn, but we're actually doing just great, you know. But again, this is the kind of thing, if you see this, then good for you. You know, that's awesome. It is findable, but I think it's very difficult. And what my main point here is, if you decided to play castles and didn't see that, it's still a mistake for you. Hate to tell you. So castles is the best move, but only if you see that line. And like I said, g6 is really not so bad. In the game g6 was played, bishop h6, d6, queen f6. So I guess the best move is something like knight b6, but it's very unobvious. Black played bishop e6, which is very logical to me. And it's funny, here my student made a very logical mistake. Like, the move knight d2, just continuing to develop is best, and I think white's a bit better, but it's not that easy to just win or anything like that. Like, it's still a pretty unclear game. Largely because black's pieces are actually pretty good here. But the bishop on h6 is still a nuisance, all of this. You'll notice, by the way, that a lot of mistakes in, especially players who are novice players, but even like intermediate or even expert and master, I hate to tell you, often their mistakes, if you notice, it's because they do something instead of developing a piece. Not joking. This happens all the time. So if you're ever unsure, you're caught between like a developing move and a non-developing move. Unless you're sure, go with the developing move. I'm just telling you. In the game, they played e takes d6, which at first looks great because you're threatening the rook and the bishop. But there's bishop f6. And then what's funny is white took on c7, which works tactically. The idea is you're trying to hit the queen, so you don't lose a pawn. But after queen takes c7, it actually became obvious that white was in huge trouble because b2 is going to hang, the rook hangs, black has monstrous piece play and development. So even though you created this weakness, notice how the game turned around really fast. Now, it was due to the serious mistake e takes d6, but you'll notice that creating the weakness didn't end the game. And the reason why is because even though there was a drawback, it was not as big as you would think. And I also want to point out that you were presented with a serious problem, the queen on g4 attacking on g7, and without that miracle bishop f6 line, it's a serious enough problem to warrant g6, and g6 is the lesser evil compared to king f8 and rook g8. So that's really what I wanted to point out here. I have one last example for you guys. This is actually from a pretty high-level game. I gave this at a recent training camp I gave. And I found it quite interesting to see how people figured this one out. So rather than present this like a normal position, I actually give people a choice. Now, if you like this kind of thing, you should definitely check out my Chessable course. I provide a link in the description. It's mostly for beginners, but I would say that it overlaps with some intermediate stuff. I've known some intermediate players who did it who found some positions challenging, so you might find it kind of interesting. Or at the very least, a good kind of overview sort of thing. And I'm actually working on my intermediate, sorry, not intermediate, and that one's on avoiding beginner mistakes in the opening. My next one is going to be on avoiding them in the middle game, which I think is a bit more advanced even. So for intermediate players, it'll be good as well. In any case, but yeah, you can definitely check out the link in the description. In this particular position, why is my blackout curtain just not functioning today? I got another thing I have to adjust. Okay, so in this particular position, it's, we have, I don't know, it's like kind of an interesting game. We're up in exchange rather, but clearly our king is not great. So rather than just give a bunch of moves, because it's kind of difficult, like taking the knight right away doesn't work out so great because the king is too exposed. Like, it's easy to think, ooh, I'll just do this and we'll trade to some endgame, but I play here and then you get mated. You should probably take with other rook, but it also leads to difficulties. So in general, I'd say that this is not you can't really take the knight yet, which is what would be kind of nice. So you have to kind of play a move to improve your position. And this is where figuring out the weak square thing is going to come in handy. Do you play the move g6 or do you play the move h6? So you're choosing between these two moves. So take a moment, pause your video, figure out which move. And again, the real hint here is which squares are more relevant that you're giving up. Remember, any pawn move gives up squares. Which are the relevant squares? So take your time, try to figure it out. So one cool thing, again, is that if you're really unsure, if you're like, oh, I don't want to create these weaknesses, there are other moves. You could play, for example, queen d7, I think is totally fine. If you're unsure about which pawn move to play, sometimes the easiest is to just not play a pawn move. I like the queen on c7 because it does hit the c5 pawn. So the much safer move is the move h6. So again, it looks scary because you're weakening this diagonal, right? If a queen lands on h7, you're going to be like, oh man, that's going to be painful. But how do you take advantage? There's no knight landing here. There's nothing like that. And it's actually very difficult for white to do anything too significant. They could play a move like queen e5, trying to threaten mate, but I play queen d7. No problem. Everything's solid. There's not a lot of moves here for black, but sometimes that's just the way it goes. You have to just make moves that don't make your position worse. Eventually, you are looking to sacrifice on d6, probably to simplify. This is not a position you should try to win. A lot of people try to win positions like this as black and get viciously mated and stuff like that. But what's really important here is, yes, you're weakening some squares, but taking advantage for white is really difficult, and there's no real way to do it. But the move g6 was played in the game, again, by a pretty strong player. It looks logical. You want to get the king out, right? You don't want the king stuck in the center. Being able to play a move like king g8, g7, even not immediately. Immediately, I don't know how well it works because there's knight e8 check moves, but being able to play that move at some point might be quite nice. But the problem is you weakening the f6 square and the g7 square and this diagonal here. And this weakness, the main difference between this weakness and the other one is that this is one white can take advantage of. So yes, it's a tactical blunder more than a positional blunder, but the concept in my mind is actually not that far apart because yes, there are tactics that do not work out for you. That is the most important thing. Tactics kind of reign supreme. It's just the way chess works. However, I would say that the weakening of these squares is one of the big reasons why tactically this is such a disaster. So the move queen e5 is absolutely deadly, and there's just no real great defense. If you try to play queen g7, queen e8 check again, this mate is not a very fun one, at least not for black. A move like king g7 allows multiple wins. I like knight f5 check. This is like the professional way, because then you have to play pawn takes, queen takes, and knight take your rook. Knight e8 check is also strong. Just make sure you don't take the rook. You take the queen, no problem. Note how it's very important that this is check. Otherwise, rook takes rook would be a problem. So that doesn't work. In the game, the move rook d takes d6 was played. And now white did not capture, but they played queen e8 check, rook e7 check, and black resigned because you have to give up your queen, and then I'm going to win a rook as well. Like if you give up the queen, I'm going to win this rook. Either by pawn takes or if you play rook f7, I'll take with the queen. So as you can see, this does not work out well, and black lost within a few moves. So it's a tactical blunder. I would say that in a lot of cases you could view it that way. But the fact is that what I really want you to remember from this video, most of all, is that every pawn move weakens squares. When you think about it in this way, you're able to then determine which squares matter, right? Okay, I'm weakening this square. Does it matter? So the number one thing with pawn moves is if you're unsure, ask yourself if it's necessary. Many times it is not. If it's not necessary, improve another piece. Improving a piece will almost never make you too sad unless there's something really amazing you could have done, Improving a piece is a much safer thing to do most of the time. So if you're ever unsure, but if you find yourself in a situation like the previous one with g7 attack where you have to ask the question, go, okay, what squares am I giving up with my pawn move? And how can my opponent take advantage of those squares? Giving up the f6 move square is not necessarily worse in of itself than h6. In a lot of ways, h6 looks uglier positionally because those light squares are like, oh, a queen gets in there or something, right? But it depends on your opponent's pieces and your pieces. Which squares can be taken advantage of? Making a weakness your opponent can't do anything about is often perfectly fine. But if you make a weakness like in this case, where white can take advantage very clearly, this is now a positional blunder because you've given up squares that now your opponent can take control over. And that's the main thing about avoiding this kind of blunder. Easier said than done, but it's definitely something when you get in the right mindset and think about how to do it and how it works, it'll make it a lot easier for you. So I hope this video has been useful, and stay tuned for more. If you haven't liked or if you liked the video, subscribe to not miss updates. Once again, check out my Chessable course if you're interested in that. I put a lot of hours into it, and I hope that it can help you out a bit more. But yeah, stay tuned, and I will see you around.